Thanks for watching this video from the Bible Fulfilled. My name's Alex Polyak. I am the director of the Bible Fulfilled. And today I'm going to be talking about one of the most frequently discussed passages about the general resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15. This is one of the most popular proof texts that supposedly shows that there will one day be a future physical resurrection. But as I'm going to show, I don't think this passage teaches that. Let me start by reading the passage. Let's see. The passage is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 51 to 57, which Paul said in approximately the year AD 57, so about 10 years before the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. And here's what Paul said. Behold, I tell you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall be changed. In a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. So when the corruptible is put on incorruption, and the mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, Death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O Hades, where is your victory? The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. And again, this is 1 Corinthians 15, verses 51 to 57. Okay, so many people say this passage is, prophesying about a future bodily or physical resurrection for God's people. But I don't think it teaches that for a number of reasons. First, notice that Paul, the writer, expected some of his audience, the Corinthians, to still be alive when the resurrection happened. He said, we shall not all sleep, but we shall be changed. This is 1 Corinthians 15, verse 51. Remember, Paul's talking to the Corinthians, not people 2,000 years later. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 1, verse 1, Paul specifically says he was writing to the church in Corinth. So that's who he's talking to, not us. And when Paul said, we shall not all sleep until this event happens, sleep is a euphemism for death. So in other words, Paul believed that the resurrection would happen within the lifetimes of some of these Corinthians that he was talking to before they died or before they slept. So this event had to have happened within the lifetimes of the Corinthians, or Paul was a false prophet. Point two, another way to show that this resurrection, also known as a general resurrection, happened in the first century is by comparing Paul's words to Jesus' words in the Olivet Discourse. Paul said the resurrection would happen when the trumpet sounded. Let me read the passage again, or at least the part of the passage that talks about this. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 52, Paul said, the trumpet will sound and the dead will be raised. Okay, so now let's compare this to what Jesus had said back during his earthly ministry, back in the year approximately AD 33. He said, quote, they will see the Son of Man coming on clouds of heaven with power and great glory, and he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. This is Matthew 24, verses 30 to 34. So Paul said the resurrection would happen at the trumpet blast, when the trumpet blasted, and Jesus said the trumpet would blast within this generation, or his generation. And by the way, a biblical generation refers to about 40 years. You can read this in Hebrews 3, verses 8 to 10, or Numbers 14, verses 30 to 34, or Nehemiah 9, verse 21. So this event, the trumpet blast or the resurrection must have happened within the first century per Jesus. And of course, this matches perfectly with Paul telling the Corinthians that, some of them will still be alive when it happens. When he said, we shall not all sleep until the resurrection happens. Okay, third point. Paul said that the general resurrection would happen when Jesus triumphed victoriously over sin and the law. Let me read that part of the passage again. This is 1 Corinthians 15, and specifically verses 54 to 57. Paul said, death is swallowed up in victory. And this is, referring to the resurrection, death being swallowed up in victory. So death is swallowed up in victory. The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us victory over these things, sin and over death and over the law through our Lord Jesus Christ. So this is 1 Corinthians 15, verse 54 to 57. In other words, Paul was saying that the general resurrection would happen when the law ended. And when did the law end? We don't have to guess about this because the writer of Hebrews, which many people believe was Paul, by the way, said that the law was about to vanish away when Hebrews was written in approximately the year AD 62. Here's what the writer of Hebrews said, quote, in that he, and he here is God, so he said, in that he says a new covenant, he has made the first, he's talking about the first covenant, obsolete. Now what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. This is Hebrews 8, verse 13. So the law was ready to vanish away when Hebrews was written in approximately AD 62. Yet in the Corinthians passage that I'm discussing, Paul linked the passing of the law to the resurrection. So the resurrection must have been about to happen when Hebrews was written in approximately AD 62. By the way, here's another verse in Hebrews that tells us when the law or the Old Covenant age would end. In Hebrews 9, verses 8 to 9, the writer says that the temple symbolized the Old Covenant age. So when the temple fell, that meant the law had, or the Old Covenant age had officially ended. And the temple fell in the year AD 70, of course. All historians agree with that. So this is when the resurrection must have happened, because Paul said it would happen when the law ended. So it must have happened, in the year AD 70. By the way, those who say that the resurrection has not happened yet also say that God's people are no longer under the law, are on the horns of a dilemma. Let me explain what I mean. If they say the general resurrection has not happened yet, then that means the law has not passed away either, because Paul said the two events would happen at the same time in 1 Corinthians 15 in the passage I just read. So this means that every jot and tittle of the law is still in force, because Jesus said not one jot or tittle will pass from the law till it is all fulfilled. And this is Matthew 5, verse 18. Now, on the other hand, if somebody says the law passed away, then that means the general resurrection must have happened too, because Paul linked the two events together again in 1 Corinthians 15. The two events cannot be separated. But it even gets worse for those people who say that the law passed away at the cross or at Pentecost, as opposed to the year AD 70, which I've been arguing for and which, Hebrews talks about, as I just read. Those who say that the law passed away at the cross or at Pentecost are essentially saying that the general resurrection must have happened then too, because as I just showed, Paul linked those two events together. Now here's the big problem with that. Paul, in approximately the year AD 60, 30 years after the cross or after Pentecost, called Hymenaeus and Philetus heretics for teaching that the general resurrection had already happened. And you can read this in 2 Timothy 2, verses 17 to 18. Now keep in mind, this was 30 years after the cross or after Pentecost. And Paul called Hymenaeus and Philetus heretics for teaching that the general resurrection had already happened. So saying that the law passed away at the cross or at Pentecost is like saying the resurrection happened at the cross or Pentecost, which is the Hymenaeus heresy. Again, Paul's view was that the law still had not passed away yet, although it was about to vanish away, as it says in Hebrews 8, verse 13. Here's one more interesting side point. This Timothy passage, in which Paul called Hymenaeus and Philetus heretics for teaching that the general resurrection had already happened, brings up a glaring problem for those who believe that the general resurrection will be a physical bodies coming out of the grave kind of event. As the Timothy passage shows, again, I'm referring to 2 Timothy 2, by the way. So according to this passage, Hymenaeus and Philetus were pretty successful at convincing people that the resurrection had already happened, because Paul called them a cancer in verse 17. But how could these heretics have convinced all these people that the resurrection had already happened if it was supposed to be a physical bodies coming out of graves kind of event? All Paul would have had to do to stop this cancer was to dig up a grave of a righteous person and show them that the physical resurrection had not happened yet. Or for that matter, all Paul would have had to do was point out that the Old Testament saints such as Noah and Abraham and Moses were not, walking around amongst them physically. This would have stopped the Hymenaeus heresy cold. But evidently, the Hymenaeus heresy was not so easy to disprove. Why? Because the general resurrection is a spiritual event, not a physical event. It can't be, proved or disproved by digging up a grave or pointing to formerly dead saints. Okay, so getting back to my point, in 1 Corinthians 15, which is the passage I'm discussing, Paul linked the resurrection to the passing of the law. Yet the writer of Hebrews said the law was about to vanish away in approximately the year AD 62. So the resurrection must have happened, in the first century. So these are three good reasons we can be confident that the resurrection that is talked about in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 51 to 57, was fulfilled in the first century. First, again, Paul said, we shall not all sleep, and he's talking to the Corinthians, so Paul clearly expected some of the Corinthians to still be alive when the event happened. Second, Paul said that the event would happen when the trumpet sounded, yet Jesus said the trumpet would sound within his generation. So again, it must have happened within the first century. Third, Paul said the resurrection would happen when the law ended, yet the writer of Hebrews, which many believe was Paul, said the law was about to vanish away when Hebrews was written in approximately the year AD 62. So for these reasons, we can be confident that 1 Corinthians 15, verses 51 to 57, the famous passage about the resurrection or about the general resurrection, was fulfilled in the first century. Moreover, since the saints of the Bible are not walking amongst us today, we can be confident that this was a spiritual event. It's not a physical event. So the resurrection happened, but it's a spiritual event, not a physical event. Now, there's a common objection that is often raised to my point of view, which I want to discuss, and it's this. In 1 Corinthians 15, which is the same passage I've been discussing, Paul pointed to Jesus' physical resurrection to prove the general resurrection, which means, according to proponents of that view, that the general resurrection will be a physical event too. Here's what Paul said, quote, "Now if Christ has been raised from the dead, how do some of you," and he's talking to the Corinthians, so let me repeat it. So let me say this again. "Now if Christ has been raised from the dead, how do some of you Corinthians say that there is no resurrection of the dead? But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not risen either." And this is 1 Corinthians 15, verse 12 to 13. Now keep in mind, the Corinthians fully acknowledged that Jesus rose from the dead. That's why Paul was able to use this argument. So the common interpretation of this passage is that Paul is proving the future physical resurrection of God's people by pointing to Jesus' physical resurrection. Since Christ rose physically, which the Corinthians fully acknowledged, then so too will God's people. This is the interpretation that's often given to this passage. But I disagree with this interpretation, and here's why. Okay, first, contrary to popular opinion, Paul was not trying to prove the general resurrection per se here. That is, whether or not there will one day be a general resurrection. Rather, all Paul was trying to prove is the resurrection of a particular group of people, namely the dead, as opposed to the living. Evidently, some of the Corinthians believed that only those who are still alive at the time of the resurrection would be resurrected, as opposed to both the living and the dead. However, these Corinthians also believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. So Paul used Jesus' resurrection as proof that the rest of the dead would rise too. After all, Christ was dead and he rose, so why wouldn't the rest of the dead? But Paul was not discussing the nature of the general resurrection in these verses. And again, I'm talking about 1 Corinthians 15, verse 12 to 13. So he was not talking about the nature of the resurrection here. That is, whether or not it'll be, physical or spiritual. Although Paul does discuss that later in verses 42 to 46, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But that's not the point or that's not Paul's focus in this section in verses 12 to 13. Here, Paul is simply trying to prove that the dead will be resurrected too, just like the living. In fact, Paul said exactly that a few verses later in verses 51 to 52. Here he said, quote, "Behold, I tell you a mystery, and he's talking to the Corinthians, we Corinthians shall not all sleep, or we shall not all die, but we shall be changed in a moment, in a twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet will sound, and the dead will be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed," or we who are alive shall be changed. Again, this is 1 Corinthians 15, verse 51 to 52. So Paul says both the living and the dead would be resurrected, which is exactly what he was trying to prove in verses 12 to 13. And by the way, Paul dealt with this very same issue with the Thessalonians. Apparently, many of the Thessalonians weren't so sure either about whether or not their dead relatives would be resurrected. So Paul assures them in 1 Thessalonians 4, quote, "For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air." End quote. This is 1 Thessalonians 4, verses 16 to 17. So once again, Paul says, the living and the dead will rise. So this is the exact same issue that Paul is just talking about in 1 Corinthians 15, the passage we're discussing. He says both the living and the dead will rise. Paul's argument is, since Jesus rose from the dead, which the Corinthians fully acknowledge, therefore the rest of the dead will rise too. So that was Paul's point. Now, as to the nature of the resurrection, whether it will be a physical or spiritual event, Paul specifically says in verses 42 to 46, and we're still in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, quote, "The body is sown in corruption, and it is raised in incorruption. It is sown in honor, and it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body. There is a natural body and there is a spiritual body. And so it is written, the first man, Adam, became a living being. The last man, Adam, became a life-giving spirit. However, the spiritual is not first, but the natural, and afterwards the spiritual." Again, this is 1 Corinthians 15, verse 42 to 46. So Paul specifically says the resurrection is a spiritual event. Now, some people try to get around this passage, this rather clear passage, I might add, by claiming that Paul did not really mean that the general resurrection would be a spiritual event, even though he said it 4 times. What Paul actually meant was that those who are alive spiritually will rise physically at the resurrection. Now, I think that's a stretch. For one thing, as I just went over, Paul explicitly said it would happen within the lifetimes of the Corinthians, right? He said, "We shall not all sleep." And he linked it to the ending of the law. But secondly, Paul himself defined these terms, the natural man and the spiritual man, a few chapters earlier in 1 Corinthians 2. Here Paul says, quote, "The natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, nor can we know them. But he who is spiritual judges all things. He himself is rightly judged by no one." This is 1 Corinthians 2, verses 14 to 15. Just like in chapter 15, Paul contrasts the natural man with the spiritual man. Yet Paul is clearly describing spiritual differences here in chapter 2. So that's what he must mean in chapter 15 as well. The general resurrection is a spiritual event. It has nothing to do with physical corpses rising out of the dirt. Now, before I end, I do want to make one more point about this. While the general resurrection was not a physical event, Jesus' resurrection was a physical event. In fact, Jesus' physical resurrection was the sign or the proof of the greater spiritual resurrection. Signs point to greater spiritual events, and that's what Jesus' physical resurrection was. A sign that proved that the greater spiritual resurrection that had been prophesied all through the Old Testament had finally arrived. In fact, Jesus' resurrection is specifically called a sign in Matthew 12, verses 38 to 40, and John 20, verse 30 to 31. Jesus' physical resurrection was the sign or the proof that the general resurrection that had been prophesied all through the Old Testament had finally arrived. And as Paul said, it would be consummated or completed within the lifetimes of the Corinthians. As Paul said, we shall not all sleep, or we shall not all die, but we shall be changed, or we shall be resurrected. And the Old Testament saints that had died prior to Jesus would also be raised to life. This would be a resurrection of the living and the dead. Okay, so that is it for today. If you like this video, please hit the like button. If you want to be notified of new videos, hit the subscribe button. By the way, if for more about the topic of the resurrection, or all the other topics talked about in this video, visit thebiblefulfilled.com. There are all kinds of videos and articles there. Also, keep an eye out for my book, The End is Here, How the New Testament's Prophecies Were Fulfilled. It should be available in a few weeks. I discuss these issues in detail in that book. By the way, if you're a regular listener, you know that I've been saying my book will be available this summer, and summer has technically ended a couple days ago, and my book is still not available, unfortunately. I've been having all kinds of publishing and editing issues that I've been dealing with, but I think I got it all figured out now. Well, I think my publisher and everything, it's all figured out now, I hope, fingers crossed. So I think it should be out in a few weeks, a couple, 2-3 weeks. That's what I'm guessing. So, but anyway, it should be out anytime now. Okay. So keep an eye out for that if you're interested. Okay. So that's it for today. Thanks again for watching this video. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time.